The warning siren didn't even have time to wind up before the magnetic locks on Caleb's workshop door shrieked and failed. The heavy plasteel slab exploded inward, twisting like wet cardboard under the force of a kinetic ram, filling the cramped, ozone-smelling air with choking dust and sparks. Caleb Vance didn't fight. He was a scavenger, not a soldier, and he simply raised his grease-stained hands, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, as 4 silhouettes emerged from the smoke. They were towering figures clad in the pristine iridescent armor of the Celestial Guard, looking like gods descending into the hell of the Undercity. The lead soldier stepped forward, his faceplate sliding back with a hydraulic hiss to reveal the pale, violet skin and vertical pupils of the highborn ruling caste, his energy spear leveled directly at Caleb's throat. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, the metallic taste of terror flooding his mouth, realizing that this wasn't a random purge or a tax collection. They had found the prototype, the unauthorized neural visor he had spent 3 sleepless nights soldering for the blind girl who hid in his shadows. And now, the penalty for touching a member of the royal bloodline was about to be delivered in plasma and pain. But the soldier didn't fire. Instead, he stepped aside to reveal a figure cloaked in white silk who whispered a command that froze the blood in Caleb's veins. "Take him alive. The mother wishes to see the monster who dared to fix her mistake." Life in the sump of planet Othris was a daily war against corrosion, a place where the sun was just a rumour and the air tasted of sulphur and recycled despair. Caleb was a relic of a failed colonization, an ex-combat engineer scraping by fixing the junk that fell from the glittering floating cities above, his world reduced to the 4 walls of a garage that vibrated with the hum of ventilation fans. He had resigned himself to a life of solitude, convinced that his legacy would be nothing more than a pile of rusted parts, until the day the shadow appeared. She was a wraith of a child, an Othrian highborn with skin like polished amethyst, but her eyes were clouded over with a milky white film that marked her as defective. She didn't speak. She just sat on a discarded fuel crate in the corner, her delicate, pointed ears twitching as she listened to the rhythm of his work. Caleb ignored her at first, afraid of the trouble she represented, but the silence of the workshop began to change. It wasn't empty anymore, it was shared. He found himself deliberately clanking tools just to see her react, realized he was narrating his repairs just to hear the soft melodic hum she made when she understood. The decision to build the visor didn't happen in a flash of inspiration. It came from a slow, agonizing realization that he couldn't stand the darkness she lived in. It started with a scavenged optical sensor from a crashed security drone, illegal to possess, dangerous to modify. Night after night, Caleb hunched over his workbench, his eyes burning from the fumes of cheap solder, fusing delicate Othrian microfilaments with rugged human wiring. He failed constantly. Circuits burned out. Neural interfaces rejected the signal, and he threw his tools across the room in frustration, asking himself, "Why am I doing this? I'm just a scavenger. If they catch me, I'm dead." But then he would look at her, bumping her shin against a table or flinching at the hiss of a steam pipe, and the anger would fade into a desperate resolve. When he finally finished the prototype, a jagged, ugly thing of matte black metal and exposed wires, he trembled as he placed it over her eyes. He held his breath, terrified he had fried her brain, until she gasped. She didn't scream. She reached out, her small purple hand tracing the air until it found his rough, scarred cheek. She traced the lines of his face, tears leaking from under the visor. And for the first time in 20 years, Caleb felt like he wasn't just surviving, he was living. But the happiness was fragile, shattered by a sudden, deafening absence. The girl, whom he had secretly named Spark, vanished. For 5 days, the crate in the corner remained empty, gathering dust. The silence in the garage mutated into a suffocating weight. Caleb couldn't work. He stood by the door, staring into the smog, his gut churning with a cold, frantic energy. Rumours drifted down from the ventilation shafts connecting the sump to the sky spire. Whispers of a royal cleansing, a ritual where imperfect children were exiled to the acid wastes to keep the bloodline pure. Caleb looked at the spare battery charging on his bench, the one he had promised to give her, and felt a snap inside his chest. Logic told him to run, to hide, to forget the royal cast-off, but the memory of her small hand on his face outweighed his survival instincts. He grabbed his coat, shoved the battery into his pocket, and stepped out into the toxic rain. He knew the path to the elevator. He knew the guards would kill a human on sight. But Caleb Vance was done hiding in the dark. He was going to look the gods in the eye and demand his daughter back. The ascent to the sky spire was a blur of intimidation and blinding light, escorted by guards who looked at him as if he were a stain on their pristine floor. They dragged him into the Hall of Echoes, a throne room of translucent crystal suspended miles above the clouds, where the air smelled of ozone and lilies, too clean, too sharp. Sitting on the high throne was High Priestess Lyra, a woman of terrifying beauty with flowing silver hair and eyes that pierced through Caleb's grease-stained jumpsuit. She held the crude visor in her elegant hands as if it were a dead rat. "You contaminated her," Lyra whispered, her voice echoing in the vast chamber, trembling not with anger, but with a mother's terrified confusion. "You took a sacred vessel and wired it with human filth. Why? Why would a ground crawler dare to touch the princess?" Caleb stood alone in the centre of the room, his knees shaking, but he lifted his chin. "Because she wasn't broken, my lady," he rasped, his voice rough compared to their melodic tones. "She was just alone, and nobody else was helping her." The tension in the room thickened, suffocating and sharp, as Lyra ordered the child, Ilara, to be brought in. The girl was stumbling, terrified, stripping of her royal finery and dressed in the grey rags of an exile. When she heard Caleb's breathing, she cried out, "The Maker! He is here!" Lyra hesitated, the mask of the ruler slipping to reveal the desperate mother underneath. "Show me," Lyra commanded, tossing the visor at Caleb's feet. "If you hurt her, I will dismantle you particle by particle." Caleb knelt, his hands gentle and steady despite the energy spears pointed at his back. He whispered, "It's okay, Spark, just like we practiced." He slid the visor on. The transformation was instantaneous. Ilara stopped shaking. She looked up, the sensors whirring softly, and pointed a trembling finger at the throne. "Mother," she said, her voice full of wonder, "you are shining, and you are crying." The court fell into a stunned silence. Lyra descended from the throne, falling to her knees beside her daughter, touching the ugly metal mask with reverence. For the first time she looked at Caleb not as a pest, but as a miracle worker. That evening, the cell Caleb expected was replaced by a guest suite, and the execution became a private audience on the high balcony. Lyra dismissed her guards, standing beside Caleb as they looked down at the swirling storms of the Undercity. The barrier of species and caste seemed to evaporate in the cool night air. She touched his hand, his rough, scarred, grease-stained hand, with her cool, smooth fingers. "We have lived for 1,000 years believing perfection was the only way," she admitted, her voice breaking. "How did a species so short-lived, so fragile, learn to fix what the gods deemed broken?" Caleb looked at her, seeing the loneliness behind her power. "We break easily," he said softly. "So we learn to mend. We don't throw things away, Lyra. We adapt." The chemistry was palpable, a dangerous gravity pulling them together, a queen and a scavenger finding common ground in their love for the child. But the moment was shattered by a servant bursting onto the balcony, face pale as ash. "My lady!" the servant screamed, falling prostrate. "Lord Varek has taken her. He says the bloodline must be cleansed. He has taken the princess to the dead zone." Panic paralysed the spire. The Othrian guards, so lethal in the city, were useless in the dead zone, a graveyard of ancient ships where magnetic storms fried advanced electronics and the air melted skin. Lyra was frantic, pacing like a caged tiger, her power useless against a chaotic environment. Caleb watched the high-tech drones spiral and crash on the monitors, and felt a cold, focused anger settle over him. "Your soldiers fight with computers," Caleb said, grabbing Lyra's arm to stop her pacing. "Down in the sump, we fight with physics. I'm going." He didn't wait for permission. He raided the palace armory, ignoring the elegant energy blades and grabbing a heavy kinetic rivet gun and a lead-lined hazmat suit used for deep-core salvage. He looked like a monster of leather and lead, but when he looked at Lyra through his faceplate, he promised, "I'm bringing our daughter home." The hunt through the acid wastes was a nightmare of screaming winds and pools of bubbling sludge. Caleb tracked Lord Varek's party not by heat signatures, which were blinded by the storm, but by the boot prints in the mud and the disturbed vegetation. He moved like a predator, using the skills of a scavenger who had survived hell to hunt down a lord who had never known hardship. He found them sheltering in the hollowed-out hull of a crashed freighter. Varek was holding Alara by her hair, dangling her over a chemical pit, shouting about purity and the sins of the mother. Varek's guards were struggling, their energy shields flickering and failing in the magnetic interference. Caleb didn't announce himself with a speech. He fired a flare into the ceiling, blinding their thermal sensors with a burst of white phosphorus, and then he charged. The battle was brutal, short and ugly. Caleb slammed into the first guard, using the hydraulic strength of his suit to shatter the alien's fragile glass helmet with a single blow. Varek spun around, drawing a humming energy sword, moving with supernatural speed. But he was arrogant. He lunged for a graceful kill, and Caleb simply stepped inside the guard, taking the energy burn on his thick shoulder plate, and drove a rivet into Varek's knee. The Lord screamed, collapsing into the mud. Caleb stood over him, the difference between them stark. One born to rule, one built to survive. Caleb didn't kill him, he simply punched him, a raw, primitive blow that shattered the alien's nose and his pride. He scooped up Alara, shielding her face from the acid rain with his own body, and activated an emergency extraction balloon. As they lifted off, leaving the disgraced Lord writhing in the filth, Alara clung to Caleb's chest, sobbing, "I saw you, Papa. You looked like a giant." Caleb held her tight as the balloon ascended, watching the lights of the city draw closer, realizing that saving the girl was the easy part. Surviving the politics of being the human who humiliated a High Lord would be the real war. The return to the Sky Spire wasn't just a rescue, it was a revolution. Lord Varek was stripped of his titles and exiled to the very wastelands he had tried to use as an execution ground, his purest faction crumbling under the weight of his public humiliation at the hands of a primitive human. Lyra met the transport on the landing pad, disregarding all royal protocol. She didn't wait for the ramp to lower fully, she ran to them, her white robes dragging in the soot. She embraced Alara first, checking every inch of her, and then she turned to Caleb. He tried to bow, to retreat into the background, filthy and bleeding, but Lyra grabbed his face with both hands. In front of the entire court, in front of the cameras broadcasting to the whole planet, she kissed him, a desperate, claiming kiss that shattered 1,000 years of segregation. In the months that followed, the rigid caste system of Othris began to crack. Caleb didn't accept a title of nobility. Instead, he took the title of First Architect. He led a program to integrate human ingenuity with Othrian resources, creating filtration systems that finally began to clear the smog from the Undercity. Alara thrived, her visor becoming a symbol of innovation rather than shame. She was often found in Caleb's new workshop in the palace, her small hands learning to solder and code, a blind princess who could see the future better than any seer. The romance between Caleb and Lyra settled into a deep, steady rhythm. They were the balance to each other, her cool wisdom and his fiery resilience. One night, Lyra confessed, "I spent my life guarding a tower of glass, terrified it would shatter. You showed me that things are stronger when you build them from scrap." The story ends a year later at the Festival of Unity. Caleb stood on the high balcony wearing a suit that was a blend of Othrian silk and human leather. Below, the streets were filled with humans and Othrians mingling, the fear gone. Alara ran up to him, wearing a sleek golden version of the visor, glowing softly in the twilight. She hugged his leg, looking up at him. "Look, Papa," she said, pointing to the horizon where the sun was piercing the clouds for the first time in centuries. Lyra stepped up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, where a new life, a bridge between their species, was growing. Caleb looked at the sun, then at his family, realizing that being human wasn't about being the strongest or the most advanced. It was about being the one who refused to accept the dark. He had fixed the visor, he had fixed the city, and in doing so, he had healed himself. Some heroes are born in the light, the best ones are forged in the dark.